This is Radio EcoShock with Alex Smith.
With so many things, people who've lost their homes, the 50 million who don't have health insurance, all the groups of people who've been affected by the greed on Wall Street, they have had it. Occupy Wall Street.
You've just heard clips from the Battle of Wall Street from Dissolve. Find it on YouTube. You'll hear more of it all through this program. Yes, retake the world for the 99%. From the occupied planet, I am your shadow, Alex Smith. We start out this edition of Radio EcoShock with an unhappy birthday greeting from Robert Walker of the Population Institute in Washington, D.C. Then we'll devote the rest of the program to an in-depth workshop on renewable energy, not for the big utilities, for you, for your home, cottage, or RV, with Bill Kemp, author of the Renewable Energy Handbook. You need to save money? You want independence? Think off the grid. Happy birthday, humans. At the end of October 2011, the 7th billion person will be born here on Earth. With over 1 billion humans already going to bed hungry every night, this may not be a blessed event. Just 12 years after we hit the 6 billion mark in 1999, it's going to be a lot harder to look after the new arrivals. The extra billion people will find an unstable climate, declining energy and resources, and a host of other challenges. To help us sort out what that means and what can be done, we're joined by Robert Walker, Executive Vice President of the Population Institute in Washington. He's the author of a new report, From 6 Billion to 7 Billion, How Population Growth is Changing and Challenging Our World. Bob Walker, welcome to Radio EcoShock.
Thanks, Alex.
Bob, you've been on every major television network, yet why do I get the feeling the average Western citizen thinks population growth is just a problem for the other side of the world?
Well, I think a lot of Americans, first of all, believe that population growth is not a problem at all, that there have been many forecasts in recent years that population growth will soon begin to decline, and that as a result of falling fertility rates, someday we'll actually be faced with what's called a birth dearth. But the reality is really sharply different than that. As you indicated a few minutes ago, world population will reach the 7 billion mark on October 31st, and current projections indicate that we'll add another 1 billion people to the planet over the next 13 years and 2.5 billion people to the planet over the next 40 years. And the real question for Americans and for everybody in the world is that population growth sustainable? And there are a lot of reasons to believe that it's not.
Well, aside from the chapters on solutions in your new report, and we will get to those, some of the most interesting pages to me were the comparison of global prospects in 1999, that 6 billion person world, with the outlook today in 2011. Why don't we start with something at the top of most people's minds these days, the economy? Can you compare then and now?
Well, when we look back at 1999, when world population reached the 6 billion mark, the human prospect overall looked immeasurably brighter than it does today. The prices of energy and food were at or near historic lows. Hunger and severe poverty in the world were on the run. The world was warming, but hopes were high that the nations of the world would soon act to reduce the level of greenhouse gas emissions and avert the worst effects of climate change. And the global economy was booming. It appeared that the United States and other donor nations would provide the foreign assistance that would be needed to accelerate human and economic development. And while there was growing concern about humanity's impact on the global environment, many people believed that world population would start to decline by mid-century, and that long before then, advances in the uses of renewable energy and green technology would reduce humanity's ecological footprint. But unfortunately, over the past 12 years, trends have not gone according to that script. Oil prices shot from $10 a barrel in 1999 to an average of over $100 a barrel today. The prices of grains and other essential foodstuffs have more than doubled. Hunger and severe poverty have made a substantial comeback. The fight against climate change has been nearly abandoned. The global economy has been battered by 2 recessions since 1999. Economic development assistance has fallen short of expectations. Water scarcity and resource limitations have grown more acute. And the transition to a green economy has not been swift as many people hoped. So we're facing a much different world today, including the economy, but not limited to the economy.
Yeah, I know. In 1999, peak oil was something for a few pundits that were relegated to the fringe. Now the International Energy Agency and the military even say we passed the peak. Our civilization is based on cheap fossil fuels. So how are we supporting an extra billion people?
Well, that's the critical question, is if we are having trouble today feeding 7 billion people, and as you indicated earlier, there are about 1 billion people on the planet today who go to bed hungry at night. And there's plenty of reason to believe that it's going to get more difficult, not easier, more difficult to meet the demands of food in the future. We have to overcome a wide range of obstacles when we think about trying to increase food production to feed 10 billion people in 40 years. That includes, of course, climate change with increasing flooding, increasing drought, rising temperatures. But it also includes the rising price of energy because that translates into a higher cost for transporting food, but also for fertilizers that's used to grow food. We're faced with very serious loss of topsoil, with desertification in many parts of the world. We're seeing water levels drop such that we probably will be able to do less in the way of irrigation of crops in future decades. So we face really some very significant obstacles to meeting the world's demand for food. The Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that worldwide we'll have to increase food production by 70% over the next 39 years, and that in the developing world we'll have to double food production. That's a very significant challenge, and there's lots of reasons to believe today that we're going to have great difficulty meeting that challenge.
Well, how do food prices compare in 1999 versus today? We all think it's gone up, but do you have hard numbers on that?
Sure. The real question for people in the developing world is what is the cost of basic commodities like a loaf of bread, like a bowl of rice, or cooking oil, or so many of the other basic food commodities that we sort of take for granted in this country. And overall, when you look at the Food and Agriculture Organization's food index, today it's about 230 over a base period of 2002 to 2004. And what that means is that on average, basic foodstuffs have gone up in price by about 2.5 times. So that in many areas, for many food commodities, people are paying twice or even 3 times as much as they were paying just 5 or 6, 7 years ago.
This is Radio EcoShock with Alex Smith. We're talking 7 billion people with Robert Walker, Executive Vice President of the Population Institute in Washington, D.C. As you say, Bob, there are still a bunch of people out there who claim technology will support 9 billion people or even 12 billion people. We talk about climate deniers. It seems to me there are also population deniers.
There's no question that there are a lot of people who believe that we can just keep on growing the way we've been growing. And, you know, if you look back at the 20th century, there was a lot of reason for optimism. World population went from 1.5 billion to 6 billion in the course of the 20th century. And despite that growth in population, we saw a very significant increase in standards of living, increased longevity. And so many people assumed that, well, gee, we can keep on doing that forever. What they forgot is that we live on a finite planet with finite resources, and that at some point we begin to approach what economists call limits to growth. And what we're seeing in the changing prices of basic commodities, that includes oil and fossil fuels, but it also includes food, and it also includes other metals and minerals. What we're seeing there is a very pronounced shift in the last 12 years. We're seeing actually soaring prices for all those commodities, or virtually all of those commodities, and there's no relief in sight. So what that suggests is that the global economy today is overheated, and quite physically, the planet is overheated, as we've seen the fact that the last decade was the hottest decade on record, and that we're seeing a lot more in the way of record floods and record droughts. So there's a lot of reason to believe that the fears that have been expressed for over half a century now, that someday we would begin to reach limits to growth, those fears are now beginning to be realized.
I realize this is a very complex thing to try and model out, and maybe we should leave it to science fiction writers, but have you come across ideas of what a world with 9 billion humans would look like?
Well, for starters, we do know that food prices are going to continue to rise, that the very sharp increases we've seen over the last decade will likely continue into the future. Various groups, including Oxfam International, have released reports indicating that food prices over the next 20 years alone could easily double or triple again. And that would have a devastating impact on the world's poor, particularly the world's poor who live in urban areas. Right now, we have 1 billion people in the world, actually more than 1 billion people, about 1.2 billion people in the world, who are living on less than $1.25 a day. And many of them are spending 50, 70, or even 80 or 90% of their income to buy food. So if we see food prices double again, the consequences for the world's urban poor who have no place to turn will be that they will be on the verge of starvation. Now, of course, many poor live in rural areas where they're sort of removed from the global economy. But even in those rural areas, what we're seeing in many parts of the world today is that as water levels drop, and irrigation is no longer as plentiful as it once was, we're seeing that farmers are facing a very formidable obstacle to expanding food production. So to the extent that we're seeing a lot of population growth in these developing countries and rural areas, even there, the challenge is very, very significant. And I think the biggest concern we have to be worried about is what happens to the world's poor when the price of food goes up another 100 or 200%.
Yes, that may not just stay on the other side of the world, as we saw with terrorism as a possibility, or, even just watching this on your big screen TV is going to be psychologically damaging for all of us if we don't do something. And I want to get to the solutions. I want to ask you one more question first, and this one isn't discussed at polite dinner tables. It's a bit of a risky thing for a media interview, but there is a suspicion that some races, religions, or countries don't want to control population. They want to win dominance by flooding the world with their kids. Is that just conspiracy theory, or is there some truth lurking there? What do you think?
Well, there certainly are some religious obstacles in some parts of the world, not in all parts, but in some parts of the world, to expanding birth control options for women. There are, in some areas of the world, belief that modern contraceptives should not be used by women to avoid a pregnancy. And that certainly is an obstacle. I don't know that it's being driven by what you describe as a desire to sort of take over the world, but nevertheless, there are places where religion is an obstacle, and also probably a bigger obstacle, though, really is those areas of the world where there's real male domination, where women don't have any say-so in how many children they're going to be able to bear. It's no coincidence that you'll find that the highest birth rates or fertility rates exist in those countries where respect for women is low, where violence against women is high, where girls and women don't have the same kinds of opportunities that they do in other parts of the world. So religion is a potential barrier here to lowering population growth, but I think it's more of a question of changing attitudes towards women.
The George W. Bush administration was famous for advocating abstinency as a population control measure instead of making contraception available. Has there been much real improvement with the present Congress or Obama?
Well, we saw in the last 2 years, or certainly in the first 2 years of the Obama administration, a very significant increase in support for international family planning assistance. In fact, we saw about a 40% increase. But with the election of the new Congress, the Congress that took place in January, we've seen a reversal of fortunes. And now Congress is intent upon not only reducing international family planning assistance, but also eliminating or slashing federal assistance for family planning here in the United States. We forget, perhaps, that many low-income women really depend upon government-run family planning clinics that are supported by both state and federal government funding. And we've seen in cases such as New Jersey where state support for family planning clinics has been eliminated, and in Texas where it's been cut this year by 2/3. And Congress is considering a measure that would eliminate all federal support for family planning in this country. So we're seeing, possibly at the worst time, a real swing in the United States and even in some other donor nations, a swing against family planning. And that would have catastrophic impacts, both at the personal level for women, but also at the global level for world resources and the environment.
In your report, Bob Walker, you've set a big target for the United States for international aid for family planning. Tell us about that.
Well, we would like to see a very significant increase in U.S. support for family planning. And let's keep it in some perspective here. The United States and other donor nations spend very little in the way of support for international family planning assistance. There's today about 215 million women in the world who want to avoid a pregnancy but who are not using a modern method of contraception. To extend family planning services, contraceptives, making those contraceptives available to those 215 million women would only cost about $3.5 billion a year. Now, by any measure, whether you're looking at the federal budget or foreign assistance or whatever, that's a very, very small price. And it's a small price to pay for a healthier and more sustainable world.
The emphasis is always on empowering women and giving them choices. We're starting to see a little progress there. Even Saudi Arabia promises to let women vote and drive by 2015. Is there a connection between general women's rights and the right to control family size?
We know that in countries where women enjoy gender equity, where their rights are essentially the same as males, that fertility rates are much lower, that when women are given access to contraceptives, when girls are kept in school and allowed to reach their full potential, that they're going to elect to have smaller families. And so there's a very, very close connection between the empowerment of women and population growth rates. And it's no coincidence, as I said earlier, that if you want to look at where birth rates are still highest in the world, it's in those developing countries where respect for women is low, where violence against women is high, and where women simply don't have the same access to education and other benefits that men enjoy.
Why does delaying marriage age help, and what can we do about that?
We know that when girls in developing countries marry early, and in some developing countries, such as Yemen, it's not uncommon for girls to be married off at the age of even 8 or 9, that they will begin having babies almost as soon as they are physically capable. In fact, sometimes before they really should be having babies in terms of their physical capabilities. And so when a girl, and I refer to a girl here as a young woman at the age of 12 or 13, begins to have children at that age, it's almost inevitable that they're going to have a large family by the time they finish their reproductive years, particularly because in those same circumstances, they generally don't have access to contraceptives, and they generally have no say as to how many children they're going to have. So we have to combat the practice of child marriage. Most countries in the world have outlawed child marriage and have set minimum ages for marriage. But what we need to do is make sure those laws are enforced, but more importantly is we have to combat the cultural attitudes and behaviors that underlie the practice of child marriage. And we have to make it worthwhile for parents to keep their girls in school rather than marry them off at the age of 8 or 9. So we can do even small investments like providing lunches for girls in developing countries. And we know that that kind of practice results in girls delaying their age of marriage, staying in school, and in the end having fewer children. So that produces benefits for the girls, for the women, for their families, for their communities, and for the world at large.
Where can listeners find the Population Institute and your new report?
Well, they can go to our website, which is at www.populationinstitute.org, and on the homepage of our website, they will see the report that is entitled From 6 Billion to 7 Billion, How Population Growth is Changing and Challenging Our World. They can also access on there not only the full report, which is about 36 pages, but also a 2-page summary of the report. This is really what we declare to be a time to talk, and we're hoping that this report that we've issued will open up the global conversation about population and about family planning and about the empowerment of women.
As we close out, Bob, a personal question. How did you get going on the population issue?
I worked in this issue many years ago when I worked as a legislative assistant on Capitol Hill. But I came out of it as a deep personal commitment that humanity was really putting too many demands on the planet. That's one of the reasons why my wife and I made a decision about 35 years ago that we would not have children. We're not saying that people shouldn't have children. Obviously, we want to keep the human race strong and we want to keep it growing, but we have to keep it within the bounds of the planet and what the planet can support. And right now, there are plenty of signs indicating that we're putting too many demands on the planet, and that if we really want to raise people out of poverty and to stop hunger in the world, then we have to do a much better job of preventing unwanted pregnancies. And so I think this is really one of the most critical issues that the world faces today, and that the good news is that it doesn't cost much to expand family planning options. It doesn't cost much to keep girls in school, that we ought to be doing these things for their own purpose alone. Whether world population was growing out of control or not, we ought to make sure that every woman has the right to decide how many children they're going to bear, and that girls stay in school. These are things that we ought to do for very simple personal reasons, but we also ought to do them for global reasons.
Find the helpful new report From 6 Billion to 7 Billion, How Population Growth is Changing and Challenging Our World at populationinstitute.org. Our guest, Robert Walker, wrote it. Thank you, Bob, for sharing with us.
Thank you very much, Alex. My pleasure.
I'm Alex Smith for Radio EcoShock. Coming up next, energy independence for the rest of us.
Radio EcoShock.
The dream and the need for renewable energy just keeps getting stronger. You want to help avoid drastic climate change. You want to be independent, even if the system goes down. Perhaps you want to live outside the grid in a home or a camper, or maybe you just want to save money as electricity and fuel prices keep going up. Everybody talks about it, but how can we really do it? We're going to get a fast workshop of ideas and techniques right now on Radio EcoShock. I'm Alex Smith, and my guest has the best how-to guide on the market. It's called The Renewable Energy Handbook, written by William H. Kemp and published by Aztec Press. Bill Kemp, thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me, Alex.
Bill, in spring 2011, we talked with your publisher, Cam Mather, about his adventures living off-grid in Ontario, Canada. We shared a lot because I lived on a homestead without electricity for 10 years. Tell us about your own home living and experimenting with renewable energy.
Well, it's been quite a long time for us. This house was actually built roughly 20 years ago with the intention of being built off of the grid and trying to make it, over time, energy independent from all sources of fuel, not just from trying to get rid of the electrical grid, but also trying to reduce our propane usage, which is, a very high proportion of the fuel use in most off-grid homes. So we started off much like any other design. Starting from scratch with a blank piece of paper really helps, because the idea is that when you're going to generate your own electricity, the one thing you need to keep in mind is that the cost of the generating equipment goes up very rapidly as the demand for electricity does. So really, energy efficiency is the cardinal rule with off-grid homes, trying to make sure that you're using what energy you do produce as wisely as possible. So for an off-the-grid house, which means that it's built not connected to the electrical grid and going to be completely independent, the key thing is to look at all of the electrical appliances and try to either do without them or to purchase those that are the highest efficiency. And I should say that really anyone should do this. From an economic standpoint, it makes great sense, and an environmental standpoint, it makes great sense. You have lower operating costs and less environmental impact, but it's doubly important in an off-grid home because of the cost of generating that power. We basically didn't want to do without either, so we chose appliances that would suit our requirements and just bought the best that we could afford from an efficiency standpoint. So we still have a refrigerator that plugs in the wall and a big TV set and stereo system and the usual trappings of a middle-class life. We also did the same with the house design, that we wanted to use as little energy to both heat and cool it. And so we incorporated very high levels of insulation into the house, south glazing for passive solar, roof angles to eliminate sunlight coming in the summer but maximizing sun infiltration in the winter and that sort of thing. All in all, just producing a house that uses approximately 1/4 of the energy of the average North American home.
And have you got solar panels going or a wind generator? What have you got going there?
Absolutely. So once you've covered the efficiency side of things, then the next thing is to produce your energy. So on the electrical side, we have both a wind turbine and photovoltaic panels that are mounted on solar trackers that actually follow the sun. And we have approximately 2,700 watts of photovoltaic panels divided between two trackers that follow the sun from east to west during the day and, of course, angle higher in the sky as the sun moves through solar noon. And the solar panels or photovoltaic panels and the wind turbine feed electricity in through a set of controls into a battery storage bank, which stores the energy as direct current. And then from there, the electricity is pulled out of the batteries as required, fed into a device called an inverter, which converts it back to regular household 120 or 240 volt electricity, and then out to the unsuspecting appliances just as per a normal house.
You know, a decade ago, people off the power lines were kind of a fringe market. I'm wondering now, is it practical to use renewable energy even if you're in a city where the grid and utilities are right there and available?
That's a great question, because a lot of people look at this and say it's too expensive or it won't work for them, and that is actually not true. It's really a matter of designing for the right application. So off-grid homes are designed typically where the cost of the power line extensions to the property that you want would be prohibitively expensive. You mentioned speaking with Kem Mather a while back, and Kem is probably well over $100,000 away from the electrical line. So in his case, putting in a $25,000 off-grid system makes perfectly good sense. It gives them a great piece of property at a lower price because it may not be desirable to others, and obviously he saves money on the capital installation by putting in the off-grid system. In the city, however, there are many jurisdictions now, and Ontario is one of the leaders in North America, where you can generate electricity from various renewable sources and feed that electricity back onto the electrical grid and get paid for it at a premium green energy price. And it doesn't really matter whether you've got a rural property or you've got a house in the suburbs. As long as you've got access to sunlight, you can even put very small systems of just a few panels on the roof and actually generate some income.
Yes, we have a system here in BC. It's not as good as that. You can't sell the energy that you produce, but what you can do is you get a super low rate if you don't use any energy in the peak hours, which might usually be, from 10 in the morning till 6 at night or something like that. And then your kilowatt hour rate is extremely low. So if you can plan your energy use around that, you save a lot of money. So right there, it would make sense for me, for example, to put solar up on the roof.
Again, the thing that everybody needs to understand is that before you run out and purchase panels or put in a solar thermal system, as we would also have here, which generates hot water, it's very, very, very important to get your energy efficiency maximized because you get your best return on investment that way. So, for example, where you have time of day billing, different rates at peak and off hours, for example, you can do such things as put your hot water tank on a timer so that it runs all night and then shuts off in the morning, having plenty of hot water for the baths and showers that people have in the morning, and then coast through the day with the unit off. And, getting back to our place, part of our energy generation is, electrical, of course, but then we also capture the sun's energy for producing hot water for the house, we have a series of what are called vacuum tube solar thermal collectors, but there are also other designs. But this particular design sits on the roof and absorbs the sun's energy and pipes the heat that it collects into hot water, which is stored in a hot water storage tank. And that reduces our cost for hot water heating by almost 60% on a yearly basis. This is something that makes a great deal of sense for homeowners in urban areas as well. So when you start to combine all of these different tricks of efficiency with renewable energy generation, you can get extremely high returns on investment, and certainly lower your operating costs, as well as protect yourself against future price increases for the energy that you do use.
And you've talked about using a solar hot water heater. Will that work in the winter as well?
It depends on the location, but I always tell people that the system we have here doesn't really contribute very much in the winter months. Certainly in the part of Ontario that we live, when you're into November, December, and the early part of January, there's very, very little solar energy to count on. So that's why it's a 60% reduction in your yearly energy consumption if you have a solar thermal system. So in other words, what would happen is in all months of the year, except for the late fall, early winter, the solar thermal system provides preheated hot water to your hot water tank, and then your gas or electricity, whatever you're using, boosts it up the rest. So let's say that you were using about $1,000 a year, for example, on to heat your hot water. The system would save approximately $600 per year, and that's a pretty good rate right across Canada. That the 60% reduction would be there. So if you put in a system that costs $3,000, it would take probably 6 to, say, 7 years or so to pay it back, which is conservatively a 13% return on investment. So a fabulous place to park some money, especially in these times that people are having a hard time even getting 1% on their investments. And this is real money, because it's money that you would have had to have spent anyways if you didn't put the system in.
And your Renewable Energy Handbook even has some ideas for renters as well. Can you tell us about that?
Anybody who has, a property that they're renting can do all of the same sorts of things to improve the efficiency. You don't have to change the water heaters, for example, if it's not your property, but by all means, take out the incandescent light bulbs, which are only 2% efficient converting electricity to light, and replace them with either compact fluorescent or the newer LED lamps. If you're heating water on a stovetop with a kettle, switch to a plug-in kettle. It doubles the energy efficiency of the appliance. And put aerator faucets, the little screw-on adapters on the end of your taps. What this will do is add a mixture of air into the water and help reduce the flow of the water, so therefore reduce the amount of hot water you're using. The list goes on and on. We actually, in the book, there's a multi-page little checklist for people to go through and just make sure that they've incorporated all of these very low-cost things into their lifestyle.
Well, another little tip that I use, I'm a tea addict, so what I do is I make tea up in a big thermos, and then I can use that all day instead of just throwing the kettle on there. Like you, I've also outfitted my old camper van with solar power. My wife and I lived for 4 months on just solar on the roof and a little propane for the fridge and the stove, and I've since learned that I could have used a solar cooker instead of the stove. But anyway, it took a 100-watt panel to run everything we needed: lights, a fan, some music, occasional computer use, and that certainly beats the noise and expense of running a generator. Tell us about your experiment with an off-grid camper.
Well, exactly the same thinking as yourself. We have a nice little spot we live in the country, and right behind our property is some lakefront. So we decided that we would put a little camper down in there and park our kayaks and just have a little area to spend some time in the summertime with friends and whatnot. And we decided that we would like to make sure that there'd be lights and some conveniences. So we did pretty much exactly the same thing. I put 300 watts worth of photovoltaic panels and some deep cycle marine batteries that I just purchased at Canadian Tire. and a small $50 photovoltaic charge controller, and just put this little system together. It makes a small 12-volt DC electrical system, which, as you say, is plenty to run the lights, the fan in the RV. We have a small TV DVD player down there as well, the type that are used in cars and vans for the rainy days, and of course the iPod player and stereo for some music. A very simple design. We also run a 12-volt water pump that draws water from the lake through a filter, which then provides the non-potable water for the sink and showers and whatnot as well. So we can basically park down there and have all the creature comforts of home. You know, we did a little bit of scrounging for some of the materials and bought some of the items used. The whole package was installed for something around $500 or $600. So you save the cost of having the generator, the noise, the fuel that goes with it, and the system's perfectly reliable.
It seemed to me that the key to managing your batteries in that kind of situation is not to let them go too low, not to send them into a deep cycle very often. And I found about 11.1 volts was around the safety zone. I wouldn't let it go lower than that. I'd just turn off the lights or something. Is that your experience?
If we're talking about deep cycle batteries for a camping application, we're using marine batteries, they tend to have a fairly limited life, so I don't really get too worried about that. I think that the batteries, no matter how well you treat them, are only going to last about 5 or 6 years at the best. Now, for the off-grid home, however, that's a completely different story. You're going to be spending, a significant amount of money on those batteries, and you want to be very, very careful with them. And the best way to babysit them is to use a device called a hydrometer, which it basically looks like an oversized turkey baster. You take a little sample of the fluid or the electrolyte in the battery, and you can measure the specific gravity or density, if you will, of the electrolyte and make sure that it stays within range. And as a general rule, you definitely don't want to take a deep cycle battery below 50% of its maximum capacity in order to preserve its life, and certainly less if you can. And doing that, you should get a very, very high service life on the batteries. Some of the models that are out there now from most of the manufacturers for off-grid homes, you'll see that they'll have 20, 25-year expected lifespan on the battery.
That's pretty good, because the solar panel I got also had a 25-year guarantee, so it looks like you could project well into the future with this setup. Tell me, there's one thing I read in the book that I didn't quite understand. I guess I didn't spend enough time on it. What is a phantom load?
Well, phantom loads are something that everybody gets themselves into and just doesn't quite realize that they're there. And these are loads that are drawing energy from you, whether it's thermal energy or electrical energy, and not doing any valid or valuable work. So, for example, most folks have a doorbell. And what we don't realize is that the doorbell is running 24 hours a day and 7 days a week, just waiting for somebody to push that button. There's a device in the basement called a transformer that's hooked up to the power grid, and it's constantly drawing power even though nobody's pushing that button. Probably one of the least efficient devices on the planet. Every time you plug a cell phone or an iPod or something into the wall, you're almost always using one of the little wall adapters, or wall warts, as some people call them, the little black box that takes the 120 volts from the outlet and converts it to a lower voltage to charge up batteries and flashlights, iPods, and cell phones and the like. And these things are constantly run. Once the battery is charged up on your cell phone, it doesn't need any more charging, and so the device, the wall wart, is still pulling power away and drawing juice from you. Same thing with your TV sets and anything that runs with a remote control. They're not really off at all when you push the remote control off. They actually just go into a sleep mode, but they still draw a fair bit of power. And so for most people, the suggestion is, if you're replacing appliances, try to purchase the most efficient ones, or at the very least look for the little Energy Star logo that indicates that it's one of the higher energy efficient devices compared to its competitors, meets certain efficiency standards. If you're not planning on changing equipment anytime soon, just put a simple power bar on these appliances and turn the power off. Our house, well, I'm just actually in front of the music area here right now. So we have the TV set, and I've got the audio-visual surround sound amplifier. There's a CD player, DVD player, an old VCR player, and a phonograph, which if we left them plugged in, they would constantly be drawing power even if we weren't using them. So at the end of the night, when we're done, there's a master switch, click it off, the outlet that they're connected to just turns off and stops drawing power. And it's phenomenal how much energy these devices waste. Phantom loads account easily for the total of 3 or 4 large electric generating stations in North America. If we could kill them all overnight, it would equate to an enormous amount of energy, and it's dollars in your pocket again. You know, it may not add up to a lot. It may only be, between $6 and $10 a month, but that's after-tax dollars that are just simply being wasted and, causing additional fuel to be burnt to generate that electricity that isn't being used.
This is Radio EcoShock. I'm Alex Smith with renewable energy author Bill Kemp. Bill, I can find lots of experts who advise big power companies and large institutions. How did you start compiling all this useful information for the rest of us? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
I guess I've always been a technical guy ever since I was little, and my background has been firstly in the design of industrial control electronics, and then moving into power generation, automation, and control systems. And I've been involved in hydropower development using advanced electronics and hydraulic system designs for a couple of decades now. And so a lot of the technical information that I've gathered for work at home has just been an extension of my professional life. And I'd say that one of the interesting things that started to happen is that once Lorraine and I, my wife, decided to build this house off the grid, and we started to notice this interesting phenomena start to happen, is this connectedness. You'd sort of look up and see the wind turbine spinning around, and you'd be doing something that was using electricity, running a circular saw or something, and you'd get this sort of little Grinch smile and say, gee, that's neat. The wind's blowing or the sun's shining on the panels, making my tools work or whatever it is that we're doing. And you see this bonding with nature, and this connectedness starts to happen. And then you look at it further and you say, well, gee whiz, this is interesting. The water that we use in our rural home, we pump from a well, which is, of course, pumped with renewable energy, and we have to use the water, and, when we flush the toilets or put water down the sink, it goes to our weeping beds and septic system, and within a few weeks, it's right back into the groundwater again where we're drinking it. And, there's yet another cycle there. And so you start to be a little more aware of the fact that you don't want to be adding chemicals into that water because nature won't filter those for you. It'll filter the bugs and pathogens, but it's certainly not going to leach out industrial solvents and cleaners and this sort of thing. And so over time, as you start to understand all of these circular effects that keep happening in this sort of a lifestyle, you research more information and you start to understand the value and the meaning of biodegradable solvents and cleaners and this sort of thing. And it just becomes a sort of a very interesting long-term analysis, I guess, of how to make a lifestyle that uses very little energy but still gives you a high quality one and doesn't have any or minimal impact, I guess, on the environment. A lot of the things that happen in the Renewable Energy Handbook are pretty standard. Most folks, when they go off the grid, they understand that they have to reduce electrical loads, but they generally transport all the heavy loads over to propane. So propane cook stove, propane refrigerator, for example, and on and on. We wanted to go further than that and spent the time figuring out how to even eliminate propane from the off-grid home so that we could reduce the energy efficiency. And of course, nobody's done any of that research and work, and so that's things that I've just been working on, over the last decade and a half, trying to make a zero carbon lifestyle. So it's certainly, a slow evolutionary process, but it's been very enlightening and very fulfilling at the same time.
Well, you can watch TV or run your power tools and not feel guilty about it because you're not using a coal-fired power plant to ruin the atmosphere just by living your life.
No, and you're absolutely right, because anything that you do here at the house is not making any sort of a massive impact on the environment. So you can, do pretty much whatever you want here guilt-free.
Now, if you're on a rural property and you're out of cell phone reach, can you still communicate and get the internet?
Absolutely. There's lots of different ways of communicating. In fact, although it's not strictly an off-grid issue, I have got a chapter dedicated to that in the book. And of course, where we live, we are off the grid completely, so we're not connected to the standard telephone line. So we actually have a cell system here with an amplifier that boosts the signal with a directional antenna, and then it actually couples the cellular service through a little box that goes through all the telephones and extensions throughout the house. So we're actually chatting right now on just a regular phone that isn't connected to the phone lines at all. There's just 101 different ways of communicating now, and of course people can use PCS plug-in sticks for getting third and fourth generation wireless from cell. They can go on to Wi-Fi internet through wireless broadband providers. One nice thing for us is that we have the wind turbine tower, which we're up on top of a hill where our home is, and the tower sticks up another 100 feet. We actually rent it out to the local broadband provider here, and so we make a little bit of money in the process, transmitting Wi-Fi to all the people in the area, but we also get high-speed internet out of that as well. So there's many different ways that this can be done. Satellite can be done if you're in extremely rural places as well.
Yeah, in your renewable energy handbook, you also have quite a bit on biofuels. We may be using them already with ethanol mixed in our gas if we're in the city, but are there some better alternatives?
Biofuels they're not a panacea by any stretch. I think that there's always going to be concern about where the various biofuels come from. Ethanol from corn, in my opinion, is a non-starter. We shouldn't be using food crops to produce fuel so that we can run our SUVs and still think that we're doing an environmentally friendly gesture. I think it's more important that we get through these first-generation biofuels that are using food, get onto what are called second generation, where we would be using various celluloses and other crop wastes, if you will, to produce ethanol, and also using various types of non-food grade feedstocks to produce what are called biodiesel, which can be either blended into regular diesel fuels or used neat or straight up. It's going to be a good number of years before we get this, sorted out. And biofuels are never going to make a huge contribution to the entire North American fuel consumption requirement, but they are still there is still a place for them. And for someone who's trying to run as close to a zero carbon lifestyle as possible, they may have more merit than somebody who doesn't drive a car very much or uses public transit, which would be better in any event.
Well, Bill Kemp, our utility is just installing, they're going to spend billions of dollars installing smart meters, but as far as I can find out, these meters don't allow me to sell them electricity. It just allows them to control the appliances in my home. They might shut off the hot water heaters all for 15 minutes or something at a peak load. I'm sure that's helpful. Maybe we can avoid some coal plants that way, but what do you think about these smart meters being offered around North America?
Well, I think that one of the biggest problems we've got in North America is that we're energy hogs. We consume vast amounts of energy compared to other people in the world, and it certainly has nothing to do with our climate or our lifestyle. And if you just take a quick look at, say, Germany in the summertime, they get very similar sorts of weather that we would in parts of Canada, and yet they use, half as much electrical energy as we do. And they do that through a lot of tariff-based methods where people are penalized for using large amounts of energy and forcing them to use off-peak energy, as it were, because it's less expensive to produce. And once people get into that mindset, it doesn't become a real problem. North Americans, people in general, don't like change. And so they complain, about the smart meters. They complain about somebody building a wind farm, within eyesight of them and so on. But once things are established in the psyche of people, then they're relatively willing to accept them. Take recycling, for example. I don't think anyone in North America at this stage would argue that recycling was not a good thing. But a couple of generations ago, the concept was seen as being invasive and too much trouble, and why bother? And there was as much debate about it as there was about the use of renewables, and now everyone does it. So I think that renewables, smart meters, and all of these things are just simply tools that are going to be used to change our psyche and to get us to use energy more efficiently. And it really doesn't matter how much people protest or don't like these things. The simple fact is that governments have spent billions and billions of dollars building infrastructure to generate electricity and to transmit it and to produce oil and the pipelines for natural gas and for oil and so on. And a lot of that infrastructure is getting pretty old. If you look in Ontario, for example, the big power generating facility, Sir Adam Beck at Niagara Falls, that's almost 100 years of age, and there's millions of dollars needed to refurbish it. All the nuclear facilities here in the province are in the same boat, and we just haven't been putting money into that infrastructure and trying to artificially keep the price of electricity low. And whether we like it or not, the prices are going to go up very rapidly. And if people don't adopt more energy-efficient lifestyles and start to use their smart meters and so on wisely, they're just going to end up in a situation with these massive energy bills that are going to chew away at what precious dollars they have in the family budget. It's a get used to it and be ahead of the curve type of mindset that really we should be trying to do.
Yeah, I think with peak oil and other factors and the nuclear problems after Fukushima, I think that we'll see that energy may cost you as much as your mortgage in the not too distant future. Is there any renewable energy tech on the horizon that really interests you, things that are coming up?
Well, I get asked that an awful lot. Should I wait for this new technology, or are photocells going to get more efficient? And, I think that the thing for most people to keep in mind is that if you're going to do something and invest time and money in some technology, you need to do it today based on today's economics. The technologies that were out 20 years ago at the home level and today are almost identical. There's really not an awful lot that's different. There's a lot of grid-connected photovoltaic generation, but it's not the technology that's so much the problem, but it's rather the policy, the public policies that are the issue, and making sure that the government sets up the policies so that all forms of electricity have access to the grid at the true price. And I think that that's the key, because you can't generate electricity at the price that the government sells it now, period. It's always been wrapped in subsidization and dollars, and the simple fact is that the prices are going to go up. Are there new technologies around the corner that are going to lower the price of electricity? The answer is absolutely no. The price of electricity is going up no matter what form of technology we use. And there are lots of technologies that are being considered. Here in Ottawa, a company called Plasco is using plasma technology to incinerate garbage at massively high temperatures to generate electricity and reduce the environmental pollutants that are given off by this. Is the energy going to be cheaper? No, it'll probably be triple the price of hydro-generated power, but it will come on to the electrical grid at some point. It is now on an experimental basis. Wind tech will become and photovoltaics will become more and more competitive, but keeping in mind that all traditional sources are rising rapidly. And remember that, whether it's nuclear or natural gas-powered electricity generation, all those devices require fuels, and the price for them and the maintenance and so on, operating costs, are all going up. So I think renewables and traditional power gen in the not too distant future will start to cross cost paths and may start to settle at a price that's between double and triple what we're paying now.
In addition to your handbook, which was just updated last year, the Aztec website offers your 7-hour video training course and a DVD. Can you just briefly tell us about those?
Yes, I was asked to do a seminar for a group of primarily farmers in the province of Ontario that were looking to understand what the new policies were in the province. In Ontario, just to clarify for those that aren't here, you are allowed to sell at the home scale electricity to the grid produced from a number of renewable sources, including wind, photovoltaics, micro-hydro systems, as well as biomass and biogas. And for the homeowner, these can go up to 10 kilowatts in capacity. But for farms and other businesses, they can go much higher, up to a total of 10 megawatts using a similar program. So there was an enormous amount of interest in understanding what the different technologies were, how they got connected to the grid, and a bit of an introduction to the pricing structures. So there was a number of us that worked at this seminar presentation in Toronto a number of years back when it first came out, and we went through and gave demonstrations on the technology, discussions about how the equipment would be connected, issues of the economics, and we were also lucky to have a fellow by the name of Paul Gipe, who is one of the world's leading wind generation experts. He also gave an introduction to farm and community-owned wind turbine systems that could be installed in Ontario and indeed any province in the country, and also gave examples of what other countries have been doing to promote this type of community power. So the video series gives an overview of all of that and tries to help people who just don't want to read a 600-page book from cover to cover. They can watch the video instead.
And how do you spell Paul's last name for those of us who want to Google it?
Yes, it's Paul Gipe, G-I-P-E.
Pretty good. This is Radio EcoShock. I'm Alex Smith. I've got years of experience with renewables, not as toys, but as real power for living. I'm holding on to this book, The Renewable Energy Handbook, by our guest, William H. Kemp. The subtitle is The Updated and Comprehensive Guide to Renewable Energy and Independent Living, and it is that. This handbook is 496 pages with a good index and layout. It's loaded with charts, clear diagrams, down-to-earth how-to information. It's a keeper. Find it at aztecs.com, and that's spelled aztecs.com. Bill, we really appreciate all the help you've given us today.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
That's a good start. And check out our 12-minute interview with Nick Rosen, author of How to Live Off the Grid, on the Peak Oil page at ecoshock.org. I've lived off-grid for 10 years and camped with solar for months at a time. The sun never sends you a bill. As we veer off into uncharted times, I recommend the Renewable Energy Handbook as a recipe book for power you can count on. I want to say a quick welcome to 4 new stations: KPOV, 88.9 FM, High Desert Community Radio in Bend, Oregon; WUOW, 104.7 FM, Oneonta Community Radio in New York State; KBRP, 96.1 FM, Radio Free Bisbee in Arizona; and KPVL, 89.1 FM, The Blend, Postville, Iowa. That makes 46 stations broadcasting Radio EcoShock, with another big announcement to come. Thank you for listening. Write me anytime with your comments and guest suggestions. The address is radio@ecoshock.org. I'm Alex. Let's get together next week.
Wall Street. The battle to the saddle, and you know who's gonna win. We're the people with the power, and we outnumber them. They might have the money, but you know we've got soul. We are the ones that make the earth roll.
long-term goal is these people, especially the young people, do not want to live in a society where the upper 1% owns everything, including our political system, and the other 99% are supposed to scramble for the crumbs. We are the 99%. We are the country. We are part of not just this country, but the greater world that's being affected by this. We are the 99%. We are the 99%.